It's hard to believe how much time has passed since those days. Sometimes, it feels like it was just yesterday that Catherine and I were so in love, so wrapped up in each other that nothing else seemed to matter. We met when we were young, at university. I was in my early 20s, focused on getting my degree and building a future, and Catherine, with her bright eyes and infectious laugh, was the center of my world. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but I truly believed we had something solid, something real. But somewhere along the way, we lost that. We lost us. At first, it was small things, like missing a dinner here and there, me working late and Catherine being too tired to talk. But over time, those small things added up. I buried myself in my work, in the responsibilities that came with it. She buried herself in trying to keep up with everything else, but the space between us grew wider. I started coming home later and later, to the point where I barely recognized the woman I was married to. She was still beautiful, still the woman I married, but there was something different about her, something distant. I remember the first time I noticed her pulling away. It was about a year ago, a Tuesday night to be specific. I came home late, as usual, and found her sitting on the couch with her phone in hand. She barely acknowledged my presence, her eyes glued to the screen, her fingers scrolling through something. When I asked her how her day was, she shrugged. I thought it was just a bad day, nothing more, but looking back, I can see it now. That was the first crack in the foundation. We stopped talking about our feelings, stopped sharing our lives. It became easier to avoid each other. The romance? Gone. Instead, we spent our evenings in silence, each of us retreating into our own little worlds. I'd go to work, and she'd focus on whatever was keeping her busy at home. We became roommates more than anything else. That was when he showed up again, Trevor. I remember the day she told me about the message. We were having coffee one morning, and she was telling me how she had bumped into some old friends from high school. I didn't think much of it at the time, just her reminiscing about the past. But then she said, "Guess who I heard from last night?" It wasn't a casual mention. She was excited. Her eyes lit up in a way that I hadn't seen in years. It was Trevor, her ex from high school, the one she'd always talked about with a mix of fondness and regret. Trevor, the charismatic guy who was always the life of the party, always the one with the big dreams and the charm. The guy who had been so effortlessly successful, even back then. I never really liked him, to be honest. He always had this way of making everything about him, of making people feel like they were lucky to be in his orbit. But Catherine? She had always spoken of him with this quiet reverence, like he was some kind of ghost from her past. I never thought much of it, until now. He had recently moved back to the city after years of being abroad, and they started talking again. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just messages, right? People catch up with old friends all the time. But as the days went by, I noticed something in her that I hadn't seen in a long time. A spark. She started dressing a little differently, spending more time on her appearance, and becoming more distant. Her attention seemed divided. More than once, I catch her laughing at something on her phone, and I knew it wasn't just some silly cat video. I didn't know it then, but I was already losing her. We both were. One evening, she came to me and mentioned she was going to visit her old school. Just to see the teachers, she said, though there was a faraway look in her eyes. I didn't think anything of it at first, until she told me she ran into Juliana. That's when things started to click. Juliana was an old friend of Catherine's, someone she had been close with in her teens. I knew her too, of course, but we weren't exactly friends. What I didn't know was that Juliana had once been in love with Trevor, or at least, that's what Catherine told me later. She said Juliana had always harbored feelings for him, even after they had both gone their separate ways. Juliana had even mentioned that Trevor always had a soft spot for Catherine. "You know, he always thought you were the one," she said, almost with a knowing smile. I could hear the jealousy in her voice, though, and the way she said it made me uncomfortable. Catherine didn't seem to think much of it. She brushed it off, but I could tell it lingered. She started meeting Trevor more often, always making excuses for her late nights or sudden plans. "Just catching up," she'd say, but I could see it in her eyes. I saw how her face lit up when she talked about him. It was as if she was reliving a part of herself she'd forgotten, a part she'd never really let go of. Then came that night. I was at work, just like any other night, when she decided to meet Trevor. They went to dinner, and that was the night everything changed. I don't know what happened exactly, but when I came home, Catherine was different. Her demeanor had shifted, and there was an air about her, a strange kind of guilt mixed with something else. When I asked her about it, she just said she'd had a nice time. Too nice of a time, I later realized. The next morning, she was distant. Her eyes couldn't quite meet mine, and I could feel the tension between us. That was when I noticed her phone. She had left it on the kitchen counter, face up. I saw Trevor's name on the screen. It was just a text, but it was enough. Enough for me to know that things had crossed a line. Later that day, I asked her about it. I confronted her. "What's going on, Catherine? Are you seeing him again?" I had no idea how to ask, but the words just came out. She looked at me, her expression faltering, and then she said it. I don't know what to say. It just happened. I didn't say anything for a long moment. The words I wanted to say, words full of anger, frustration, betrayal, stuck in my throat. Instead, I simply turned and walked away. That was the moment everything began to unravel. That was when I realized there was no going back. It's strange how quickly things can change without you even realizing it. One minute, you're living your life, thinking everything is fine, and the next, everything you thought you knew about your relationship starts to crumble. That's what happened with Catherine and me. After the dinner with Trevor, things just felt different. I don't know if it was me being paranoid or if she was actually pulling away, but it seemed like overnight, everything that made our marriage strong vanished. Catherine became distant in ways I didn't know how to deal with. She started spending more time at work, going out with friends more often, and every time I tried to make plans with her, she'd come up with some excuse. At first, I thought it was just a phase, something temporary. But as the days passed, I began to realize that it wasn't just a phase. It was something more. We weren't fighting, at least not directly. We were just empty. I'd come home, and she'd be sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone or lost in her own thoughts. When we did talk, it was brief, impersonal. No more laughter, no more inside jokes, no more moments that made me feel like I was her priority. It was as if we were living two separate lives under the same roof, and neither of us knew how to fix it. I didn't want to confront her. Not yet. Part of me thought maybe this was just a phase. Maybe she was going through something that she didn't want to talk about. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about her work or her friends. Something had changed, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. That's when I turned to Adam. Adam and I had been working together for years, and he was the closest thing I had to a real friend outside of Catherine. We shared a lot of common ground, from work to personal struggles, and I trusted him. He was observant, too, so I knew he would notice if something was off. And he did. "Mark, you okay?" Adam asked one day, his voice low, as we were having lunch together at the office. He had been watching me for a while, I could tell. "You've been looking a little distracted lately." I hesitated. I wasn't ready to talk about it, not with anyone, but Adam could see right through me. "I don't know," I replied, pushing my food around on my plate. "It's just, things at home are weird. I don't know what's going on." He gave me a knowing look. "What do you mean, weird? Is everything okay with Catherine?" I didn't want to get into it, but I also didn't know how to lie. She's distant. She's been spending more time away from home, and when we are home, we don't really talk. It's like we're strangers. Adam leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Have you talked to her about it?" I frowned. I don't know what to say. I don't want to accuse her of anything, but it's like something's off, and I don't know what it is. Adam paused, then gave me some advice that I knew was hard for him to say. "You should talk to her, Mark. I don't want to sound like a therapist, but if something's wrong, the only way you're going to fix it is by talking to her directly. Don't wait until it gets worse." That advice stuck with me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I didn't want to face the possibility that things might be irreparably broken. I thought maybe it was just a rough patch. Maybe we were both just stressed out, and time would heal things. But I was wrong. Catherine seemed to be living in her own world. I started noticing her little lies, small things, like telling me she had late meetings or had to stay late at work. But then I found out from her sister, Emily, that Catherine had been skipping out on her responsibilities at home. Emily had been calling more often to check in, but Catherine's absence had become more apparent. I could see the concern in Emily's face when she came by one evening. "You need to talk to her," Emily said quietly, as we stood in the kitchen after Catherine had gone out for another work dinner. "She's not herself lately. I've tried talking to her, but she won't open up." I didn't know how to respond to that. Emily wasn't the type to stir up trouble, so if she was noticing it, something was definitely wrong. But still, I couldn't bring myself to confront Catherine. Not yet. Then came Laura, Catherine's best friend. She had been trying to help Catherine through whatever emotional crisis she was going through, but even Laura started to notice that something was off. One evening, after I had gone to bed early, Laura came over and sat down with Catherine. I overheard their conversation from the other room. "Cat, what's going on? You're distant, and I don't know if it's just stress or something more. You've been avoiding me, and you don't seem like yourself anymore." Catherine didn't answer immediately. I could hear her shifting in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm fine," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "It's just a lot of work, a lot of pressure." But Laura wasn't buying it. "You're not fine, and you've been pulling away from Mark. You need to talk to someone about this. Whatever it is, you can't just bottle it up." But Catherine refused. "I don't want to talk about it. I just need space." I knew something was going on, and I wasn't the only one who knew it. Everyone could see the cracks. But Catherine wasn't ready to admit what was happening, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. So, I decided to leave. I thought maybe some time away would give me perspective. I had a business trip planned for a few days, and I hoped that the distance would help me figure out if this was just a phase or if it was something much more serious. Little did I know that while I was away, Catherine's relationship with Trevor would intensify. They had been seeing each other under my nose, and I had no idea how deep it had gone until it was too late. During my trip, I got a message from Catherine one night. "I'm going away for the weekend." "Work thing," she said, but her words felt hollow. What she didn't tell me was that she was going to meet Trevor, and this time, it wasn't just a dinner. It was a getaway, a trip to another city, far from everything. I never saw it coming, but while I was struggling to figure out what was going wrong at home, Catherine and Trevor were getting closer. And it was that weekend that everything changed. When I returned, nothing would ever be the same. Catherine had crossed a line that I couldn't come back from, and neither could she. When I came back from my business trip, I wasn't expecting anything major. I thought the space would have given me some clarity, maybe even helped me see that I was just being paranoid. I wanted to believe that Catherine had just been going through something, work stress, maybe a personal issue, that had made her act distant. But the moment I walked through the door, I knew something was off. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen table, face up. It was unusual. Catherine wasn't the type to leave her phone lying around, especially not when she was out. I don't know why I decided to pick it up, but I did. Maybe it was the feeling of unease that had been growing inside me. Maybe it was my gut telling me that something was wrong. I scrolled through her messages, hoping to find an explanation, something that would make sense of everything. And that's when I saw it. Messages from Trevor. Texts that went back days. Messages that were full of flirtation, inside jokes, and plans to meet up. My stomach dropped. The gut feeling was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a reality I couldn't escape. The more I read, the clearer it became. Catherine had been seeing Trevor behind my back. The lies she told, the excuses, the late nights. Everything was a cover for what had been going on. My mind couldn't process it at first. I wanted to believe that it was a mistake, that maybe there was some misunderstanding. But the texts weren't vague. They were intimate, full of emotions that Catherine had never expressed to me in a long time. She was involved with him, and it wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. She had let herself fall into it. My heart shattered as I read the words. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, though that hurt more than I could have imagined. It was the realization that Catherine had given something to someone else that I thought only I deserved. She had opened herself up to Trevor, not just physically but emotionally, in a way I hadn't seen her do with me for years. I put the phone down, but the weight of it all pressed down on me. I was angry, but more than that, I was heartbroken. I had given everything I had to this woman, and here she was, with him. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind? I couldn't just sit there, drowning in my thoughts. I needed to confront her, to hear her explanation, even though I already knew what the truth was. When Catherine came home that evening, I didn't waste any time. I was furious, but I also felt like I was running on autopilot. Like my body knew what had to happen even if my mind wasn't fully prepared. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though the anger was bubbling just beneath the surface. "You said you were working." She froze, looking at me in surprise, but I could see the guilt flash in her eyes. It was enough. I was, she stammered, but she knew it wouldn't work. She knew I had seen the messages. I didn't say anything for a moment. I didn't have to. I could see her trying to come up with a lie, but the weight of everything between us made the words feel empty. Finally, I asked, "Catherine, what is this? What's going on between you and Trevor?" She tried to play it off, looking away and shaking her head. "It's not what you think, Mark. I swear, it was just a mistake. A temporary lapse in judgment." Her voice cracked, but her words were weak, flimsy. I wasn't thinking. It just happened. I couldn't believe it. I was shaking with anger, but more than that, I felt a deep, crushing sense of betrayal. "A lapse in judgment?" I repeated, my voice rising now. "You've been meeting him behind my back. You've been texting him for days, making plans, and you think this is just a mistake?" She opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. She knew there was no excuse, and that realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She stood there, helpless, unable to say anything that would make this right. I let out a bitter laugh, feeling the tears start to well up. "I've given you everything, Catherine, and this is what you do? You're not just cheating on me physically. You've been emotionally checking out for months. And now I'm supposed to believe this was some temporary lapse?" The silence between us felt suffocating. There was nothing left to say. My trust was gone, and with it, the foundation of our marriage. For days, I struggled with the fallout. I distanced myself from her, from everything that reminded me of the life we had built together. I went through the motions, but it felt like I was on autopilot, just going through the actions without really living. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. It was like I was in a fog, trying to make sense of what had happened. In an attempt to understand myself and my feelings, I started seeing a therapist. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of this emotional mess. It was hard, harder than anything I'd ever faced before. I was angry, hurt, and confused. How had things gone so wrong? How had I not seen this coming? Through therapy, I started to realize something important. I didn't just need to understand why Catherine cheated. I needed to understand what it meant for me. I had been so focused on fixing the marriage, on trying to save something that was already broken, that I had lost sight of who I was. I had lost my sense of self, and I was too scared to see the truth that our marriage was over. Meanwhile, Catherine was trying to apologize. She came to me, tears in her eyes, asking for forgiveness. She told me she was sorry, that she didn't know why it happened, that it was a mistake. But I could see it in her eyes. She was sorry for herself, for the guilt she felt, but not for what she had done to me. It was too late for apologies. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted. It took me a while to admit it, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't stay in a marriage that was no longer real. The love I had for Catherine had been replaced with resentment, and I couldn't keep pretending. And that's when I made the decision. I couldn't stay with her. I needed to move on. In the weeks that followed, I grew closer to Laura. At first, it was just a way to get back at Catherine. A form of revenge, I'll admit. But the more time I spent with Laura, the more I realized that there was something genuine there. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. We talked, we laughed, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was being seen. It wasn't just about filling the void Catherine had left. It was about finding someone who cared for me, who understood what I had been through. Ultimately, I made the hardest decision of my life. I ended my marriage to Catherine. There was no dramatic argument, no explosive confrontation. There didn't need to be. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by something bitter and cold. I was ready to start fresh, to rebuild my life with someone who respected me, who valued me. And with Laura by my side, I felt like I could finally take that first step toward healing. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was free. The day I found out about Catherine's affair with Trevor was the day everything changed. It was as if the veil had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I could see things for what they truly were. My world was torn apart, and the anger I felt wasn't just about the physical betrayal. It was about the emotional distance she'd put between us over the years. The coldness, the silence, the lack of love. I had been blind, but now that I knew the truth, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't bring myself to care about saving the relationship. It was dead. The love I had once felt for Catherine had morphed into something bitter, something full of resentment and hurt. I didn't want to fix things. I wanted revenge. I wanted her to feel the pain I was feeling, the weight of betrayal crushing me. I wanted her to know that she had made a mistake, one that would cost her everything. And that's when I turned to Laura. At first, it wasn't about her. It was about Catherine. Laura was, after all, Catherine's best friend, someone who had always been there for her. I knew that by getting involved with Laura, I could hurt Catherine in the most intimate way. It felt like the ultimate payback. Laura had always had feelings for me, but she'd never acted on them, out of loyalty to Catherine. I knew this, and I saw it as an opportunity. The first time it happened, it was more out of spite than anything else. Laura and I started spending time together, talking about everything that had gone wrong, and the more I vented to her about Catherine, the more she seemed to sympathize. I didn't expect it to go any further, but one night, the emotional tension between us shifted. It felt natural, a release, something that neither of us had been able to find in the wreckage of our lives. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just about revenge anymore. I started to care about Laura. For the first time in months, I felt wanted, cared for, things that Catherine hadn't made me feel in years. Laura was there for me when I needed someone to listen, someone who didn't judge, who didn't hold anything against me. She gave me the emotional support that Catherine had been incapable of offering for far too long. The lines between revenge and genuine affection blurred. Laura had become more than just a weapon to get back at Catherine. She had become my confidant, my friend, and eventually, someone I could see myself with. But revenge is a powerful motivator, and I couldn't ignore the thrill of watching Catherine suffer. I started to flaunt my relationship with Laura in front of her. Every chance I got, I made sure she knew we were spending time together. We'd attend social events, parties, gatherings, always making sure Catherine saw us. At first, she tried to act as if it didn't bother her, but I could see the cracks forming. I could see the way her eyes would narrow when she saw Laura and me laughing together, talking intimately. I could feel her anger radiating from across the room, but I didn't care. She deserved it. Every time Catherine saw us together, it was like a knife to the heart. She couldn't escape it. Laura had once been her closest friend, someone she trusted, someone who knew all her secrets. And now, she was with me. The realization that she had lost both her husband and her best friend seemed to break something in Catherine. She tried to convince herself that it was all her fault, that she deserved everything that was happening to her. But the truth was, it was slowly eating her alive. I could see it happening. Catherine's world began to unravel. She withdrew from her friends, stopped responding to calls or texts, and started drowning in guilt. She would lock herself in the bedroom for hours, avoiding even the simplest of conversations. The woman I had once known, the woman I had married, was a shell of herself, and I wasn't sure if I felt sorry for her or if I felt nothing at all. But she wasn't done yet. She still thought that Trevor would be her salvation, that he would be the one to comfort her and make everything better. She turned to him again, seeking solace, hoping to find something that would make the pain go away. But Trevor, it seemed, had already moved on. I could tell by the way he responded to her, distant, uninterested. He wasn't the person he had once been in her life. He had grown tired of the drama. I overheard part of their conversation one evening, when Catherine called him in a desperate attempt to reconnect. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but the door was slightly open, and I caught fragments of her voice. "Trevor, I don't know what to do. I messed everything up. I need you." But Trevor, in a cold and almost dismissive tone, replied, Catherine, I'm not getting involved in your mess. You've made your choices. I'm done. It was the final nail in the coffin. Catherine had lost him, too. Trevor, the one who had once made her feel alive, was no longer interested. And I could see the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had burned every bridge. She had betrayed me, lost her best friend, and now Trevor had cut ties with her as well. There was no one left. Meanwhile, Laura and I continued to grow closer. Our bond deepened. It wasn't always easy, though. There were moments when I could see the guilt in Laura's eyes. She loved Catherine. She had always been her best friend. And yet, here she was, in a relationship with me, the man who had been married to Catherine. I knew it weighed on her, but she justified it by reminding herself that it wasn't her fault. Catherine had betrayed us both. And slowly, Laura started to let go of her guilt, finding comfort in the love we were building. But there were still moments of doubt. "Mark, what are we doing?" Laura asked one evening, her voice filled with concern. "Is this just about revenge for you? Or is it real?" I looked at her, my heart in my throat. "It's real," I said, and for the first time, I knew it was true. But despite our growing relationship, Catherine's presence still haunted me. She hadn't given up. She finally reached the breaking point and confronted both Laura and me at a social gathering. I wasn't expecting it, but as soon as she walked in and saw us standing together, I knew it was coming. "You have to be kidding me," Catherine spat, her eyes flashing with anger. "Mark, how could you do this to me? And you, Laura? You were supposed to be my best friend." Laura flinched, but I stood my ground. "It's over, Catherine. You lost your chance. I'm with Laura now. You made your choices. I'm done." Catherine's face crumpled as if the words had hit her like a physical blow. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You're both dead to me," she whispered, her voice broken, but the words were a hollow echo of the woman she had once been. As I watched her walk away, I felt nothing. I didn't feel satisfaction, or relief, or even anger anymore. I just felt empty. I had one, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the final, painful step in a journey I never thought I'd have to take. Catherine had lost everything, and I was done. Time has this way of softening the sharp edges of pain, but it also has a way of bringing clarity. It's been months now since everything happened. Months since I walked away from Catherine and started a new life with Laura. At first, I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't sure if this was just another rebound or if it was something real, but as the weeks went by, I realized it was real. Laura and I had built something strong. We shared our thoughts, our fears, our hopes for the future. We weren't rushing things, but there was an undeniable connection between us, one that had grown naturally and beautifully over time. As we spent more time together, it became clear to me that I had found someone who understood me in a way Catherine never had. With Laura, I could be myself, vulnerable, open, and at peace. I wasn't constantly fighting for her attention or love. I didn't feel neglected or unseen. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was the fresh start I needed. I could look forward to a future with Laura, a future where I wasn't burdened by the weight of betrayal and unspoken resentment. We talked about moving in together, about our dreams for the future, and one day, we even talked about marriage. It felt right, something that was built on trust and mutual respect, something I hadn't known in years. Catherine, on the other hand, was somewhere far away, trying to find herself in a new city. I had heard she moved after everything fell apart, trying to escape the memories, the guilt, the shame that had become a constant companion. I didn't know how she was doing, and to be honest, I didn't care much anymore. I had my own life to live, but I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her, in a way. I knew what it was like to be lost, to be consumed by regret. She had destroyed everything. Her marriage, her relationship with her best friend, and whatever she had with Trevor. And now, even Trevor wanted nothing to do with her. She had called him a few times, I knew that, but he had moved on. He had stopped responding to her messages. He had stopped answering her calls. He had no interest in revisiting the chaos she had brought into his life. I think that was the final straw for her, the realization that she had nothing left. No husband, no best friend, and no lover. She had burned every bridge, and now she was standing alone. I didn't hear from Catherine for a while, and honestly, I didn't expect to. But then one day, I received a letter. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation, nor was it an angry letter filled with blame. It was an apology, a letter that, I'm sure, had taken her a long time to write. She told me how deeply sorry she was for what she had done, how much regret she felt for the way she had treated me and for the choices she had made. She told me she understood that our relationship was over, but she wanted me to know that she carried the weight of her actions every day. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say, and I didn't feel like I owed her anything. But there was something in her words that made me pause. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the woman she used to be, the one I had fallen in love with, the one who had lost her way and was now trying to find herself again. I don't know if Catherine will ever truly heal, but I hope she does. I hope she learns to forgive herself and move forward. In the meantime, life continued to move on for me. Laura and I got engaged in a small ceremony, just the two of us. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. Catherine, of course, received an invitation to the engagement party. She came, not as a guest of honor, but as a reminder of everything I had once lost. She was there, standing in the back, a quiet figure among the guests. I could see the pain in her eyes as she watched Laura and me. I could see the regret, the understanding that this was the consequence of her actions. But there was no animosity, no anger. It wasn't a moment of victory for me. It was just a painful reality. Catherine stayed for a while, but she left early. She didn't speak to me, and I didn't try to speak to her. She didn't need to be a part of our celebration, and I didn't need her to be. I had finally reached the point where I understood that I had to move on, and so did she. Catherine continued with her therapy. From what I heard, it helped her confront the deep emotional scars from her past, scars that she had ignored for so long. Her therapist helped her understand the consequences of her actions, how her choices had affected everyone around her. Slowly, she started to take responsibility for the destruction she had caused, but she also started to realize that she had the power to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was a start. Eventually, Catherine started to accept that she couldn't undo the past. She couldn't change what she had done, but she could change the future. That, I think, was the most important realization she could have had. For me, everything had fallen into place. I was no longer defined by my past with Catherine. I had a new life with Laura, one built on trust and love. I had healed in my own way, and I was ready for whatever came next. I knew that healing was a process, one that took time and effort, but I also knew that I didn't have to do it alone anymore. And so, here I am, standing on the edge of a new chapter, not looking back but looking ahead. I'm ready to embrace the future, knowing that while the road to healing might be long, it's possible. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of what comes next.